super happy to be able to show something so different in our space. So that was during a time that was like very much fresh in the period of my own loss. So of course there was that original connection with the work. But then just thinking about how this space gets used by such a variety of majors in a variety of disciplines, thinking about all the nurses that pass through, everybody in sort of the healthcare field, and thinking about really wanting to sort of add to or contribute to the relationship to these clinical spaces through the eyes of an artist. So I'm remembering a conversation that I had with Tim Lowley, who was the gallery director before me, and I said, I just want students to know that they should approach their whole life as, like, with the eyes of an artist. And he said, I don't know about that. My hope for the students is that they approach life as thoroughly themselves as possible in everything that they do. I really like that. So I think that like this definitely is such a varied experience, both living and also dying and losing a loved one. But I think that like what is so potent about this work is it's so clear that this is all experienced as thoroughly yourself as possible, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really resonates and it's powerful work, and thank you so much. So
thank you.
I'll let you say more.
Right, for sure. Thanks everybody for being here. And, thanks to the university for inviting me and hosting this body of work. I'm getting over a sinus infection. I'm not contagious, but I'm on a lot of drugs. So, and my voice is a little bit shot, but I'm going to do the best I can here. Yeah, it's interesting to think about like living as yourself, living as an artist, because as an artist, I think there are many ways of defining what that means and where we find art and where we apply the things that, especially those of us who make things or who make things or study making things, end up putting our efforts. So usually when we come up in education, we're thinking about galleries and museums and that sort of thing. But I think it's possible that the way that we look at the world ends up shaping how we approach everything. And this, for me, has been really personal work, because as those who've read the statement, in 2019, my partner was diagnosed with cancer, and we began a 2-year journey in treatment spaces. And my own work has typically been engaged in looking at how architectural spaces in the built environment can express power, can express social relationships. And usually it's been very kind of heady, like, oh, we're going to look at how museums operate, or we're going to look at how, like, I finished a film recently on a Nazi resort in Germany that was built for working class Germans. And so there's a lot of distance there, because like it's not 1930 and I don't live with Nazis and, you know, blah, 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 blah. But this was very obviously personal work. And it utilizes strategies that I've been using in other work unintentionally. So I've often worked with strategies of archiving. So finding patterns of things specifically in architecture, like window sets that are all the same in a dorm building rather, or the interior of hotel spaces over and over again. And looking for the things that make those spaces unique through that repetition. In these spaces, you know, I think part of it is shock and awe that you're in these spaces that you have to spend a lot of time in. There's a lot of waiting. You don't have a lot of autonomy because you really are reliant on the nurses and the doctors and the other staff to set the pace of care. Meanwhile, there is this kind of institutional requirement, right? You need spaces that have hard surfaces so that they can be cleaned. You need access to certain kinds of infrastructure, like gases and water and stuff like that. And there are all the machinery and accoutrements that get moved in and out of these spaces in ways that are somewhat chaotic. On top of that, there seems to be this desire or priority, depending on what kind of spaces you're in trying to humanize very, very clinical spaces, because at the end of the day, you know, we inhabit those spaces, right? It's the doctors and the nurses and the staff have to work there, so you hope that it's not too cold and awful. And then the people who are getting treatment, who are sick, who are like working through, you know, healing or grieving or not knowing and all that anxiety, you know, there's I think a priority towards trying to humanize those spaces. I would say often it doesn't go that well, and that was one of the things that I kept noticing. And I know that there are hospitals and care spaces that are much more thoughtful. You know, we spent time up in Milwaukee at the Freer Center, and I would say that there was a kindness to the softness of some of the spaces in there that was quite nice. But at the same time, the scale of it was ridiculous because it's building after building with long corridors and bridges attaching different spaces. And so when you have all the wall space and you're trying to create a more human and approachable set of materials and conditions, I just think like what many of these places don't have is a curator, right? And what they do seem to have is a moment where they're like, we gotta put shit on the wall. And so things end up in weird spaces. And often, not always, because again, some hospitals do have collections and are really thoughtful about it, but most are not. Often what we're looking at are framed posters of masterworks that are somewhat familiar, or really pastoral images of landscapes or abstractions. And it just seems very, to me, as an artist who spent a lifetime looking at art, training to make things, talking to students about making things, and really engaged in contemporary work, which is really about ideas, it seemed mostly vacuous, right? Like, I would much rather see a window like, on a nice garden outside than, which you can't always do, than a picture of like a mediocre painting. And that's me being super critical, but moving through those spaces, there was a pattern. And so, you know, that idea of like who we are and how we train and like what we turn to, for me, you know, I would say that the process of walking into a treatment room the first time at the hospital up in Evanston, when my wife just didn't feel good, and I was like, hey, we have health insurance, might as well take advantage of that, thinking that she just felt under the weather. Next thing we know, the next day, they're like, oh, we think you have pancreatic cancer, is like 0 to 60. And in truth, we were lucky that we had never been through those sorts of journeys with our other relatives or friends. And so there's a lot of wrapping one's head around it, around potential outcomes, around how we move in steps. And for me, as somebody who makes things and looks at things and thinks about things, it often needs that space, you know, that kind of artistic space to kind of process my experience in the world around me. It was unconscious, but really natural for me just to be like, huh, that's weird. There's like weird stuff in this room that we're sitting in for 12 hours waiting for somebody to tell us something. So I was like, all right, can you just move over? All right, I'm gonna. It's all done on my cell phone. I think this is all done on my cell phone. Yeah, this is all done on my cell phone. There's some stuff done on another camera here, but I got in trouble for that. And so it was natural, in a way, to start collecting. And so the impulse was to collect where I was at, both to just try and figure it out. It was also weird because we would return to the same spaces sometimes. And so I would recapture that, just because. And I didn't really know what it was going to be. It wasn't like I was like, hey, here's an opportunity to make art. Yeah. It was literally like, I don't know, like I'm stuck here, this is weird, I've got a camera, there's so much time, I need to just have a place to process. And so for me, that's what started this work. Our journey started here and going to the University of Chicago for consults, and then eventually chemotherapy, surgery, more chemotherapy, and then a recurrence of disease, which for us, I assume I know we've all been through COVID, and this is a little bit rambly, but here we are. We found that there was a recurrence of disease in, I think, August or something like that. And so my wife wife started looking at experimental treatments, and I should say that, she was incredibly lucky, and I guess this is, if there are any nursing people here, or even civilians, we were really lucky because when she got diagnosed, I was able to call my cousin, who married a very nice woman, whose dad was the former head of internal medicine for Northwestern Hospital, which was crazy. He was retired. But we were like, hey, this is what they're telling us. And he was like, okay, you need to talk to one of these 5 people. These are the 5 best people in the country. I would never have been able to do that. I'm a researcher, but I would never have been able to do that. Then my wife, when we were in college, she had a roommate who went on to be a doctor in New York. And I thought it had something to do with internal stuff. I don't really know, not my field. But I was like, John, why don't you call Allison? She's like, oh, Allison does something else, like colons or something. That's different than pancreas. I was like, I don't know, she's in New York, maybe she knows somebody. So she called her old roommate. Turns out her old roommate specializes in pancreatic cancer, runs a not-for-profit for pancreatic cancer research, and also did the same thing. She put together a list of 5 people, and she was like, let's look at the 2 lists. We were able to find that Milwaukee had one of the best people in the country. And so that was really interesting. It was eye-opening because, again, I have health insurance. We had health insurance, which is a step up, right? From people who don't have health insurance. And then we also had this special knowledge. It was like knowing wizards, right? And we didn't go to Hogwarts, if you get the vibe. So we were able to do that. So part of that process is when the disease recurred in 2020. I think it was 2020, we're all going through COVID, you all remember COVID. So I was at Columbia College, we'd gone remote, and we were starting the fall semester. We were all teaching online, and she got into a clinical trial in Los Angeles. And within a week of her getting into that clinical trial, which is really hard, and you never know whether somebody's going to be accepted or not, because the researchers need certain bars to be met for the data to be useful to them to even bring somebody in. So she was able to get into it. And in 2020, we moved out to, within 2 weeks, we packed up our house, rented it, packed up our car with our 2 kids, our dog, and our cat, and moved to Los Angeles for a year, where we all lived as if we were still in Chicago. So I taught my classes, and my kids went to high school here. But that was our silver lining, to all be together out there while that was going on. So that was, again, kind of part of this journey of trying to figure it out. So then I was like, wait, the spaces in LA really feel different. Part of it was, if anybody follows the news, it was, I can't remember the guy's last name now, but he's the guy who owns the LA Times, who got in a lot of trouble recently, or a lot of critique recently for not allowing the LA Times to support a candidate. But he is one of the wealthiest doctors on the planet, because he started a company, or invented one of the main pancreatic cancer drugs. So he's running these clinical trials, so we're out there. And so there was kind of a different vibe out there. So that started another part of the work. And then we returned, after there was a return of disease, we came back to Evanston for the end of her life, and we spent more time up in Evanston, where I noticed, because she was on a different floor, different spaces and different weird installations. I'm going to move to the weird installation part. So you think about these interstitial spaces, and our architects and the people who are trying to plan these spaces feel like, we don't know what to do, we need something arty, or we need something natural looking. And so they do things like, put the artwork, I don't know, at the end of a hallway, or, in the case of this weird installation, this was an interstitial space over by some elevators, and they built this enclosure to put fake flowers. It's so weird. And so, yeah. So, around the time that, I'm trying to remember this, so I started working on what to do with these images when I was in LA, because I had an inkling that this was going to be a thing. And it wasn't like I was shooting a big video project. I was out in LA, I was still teaching, we're dealing with all the treatment stuff. And, we're all in lockdown, so like it was really hard to like go out and meet people and do things. So I'm like at my computer, trying to figure out what to do with these images. And it occurred to me that in many ways this was a rephotography project where I'm photographing, often photographs, because these are not really paintings, mostly they're reproductions. And I wanted to intervene in those spaces so that as the viewer, you'd pay attention to the architecture while noticing the art, but not being bewitched by it or taken by the images. So it's a pretty subtle intervention, but the intervention is to go into the photographs, to the picture area, to slightly blur out those images and darken them, and then print them. The work itself ends up being transformed in a number of different ways. You'll notice that in the space we've got these mirrors, and I fancy myself an installation artist who uses film video, and sometimes trucks and other vehicles and architecture, but at the core of my practice is always video and photography, but it was a kind of a happy accident that I had a friend who was doing a renovation, and they had all of these like smoked mirror panels, and I just absolutely love the way that they're super dated. Nobody wants smoked mirrors in their house, okay? If you go to a bar with smoked mirrors, you're like, okay, this is from like the 60s or 70s. It's weird. But what it does color-wise is it transforms the space, the reflection of the space that we're in, similarly to the way in which I'm manipulating the images, right? And so there's kind of like this doubling, for me, of placing us in our own environment, right, that's being transformed while looking at an environment where the elements have been transformed. And then the other small like intervention, which is more playful than anything, is that some of this weird infrastructure that finds its ways into the images, like the exit sign or the dome, the mirror dome on the other side. I've actually bought some of those artifacts and hung them in the space as well, as a way of pulling some of these architectural details out and decontextualizing them within this space. Yeah. So then the work continues a little bit. So I did a residency last year in Los Angeles at Automata, which is a super cool gallery in Chinatown. You should definitely check it out if you're out there. Where I put together all of the images. I think there's 72 images in the series, and I used generative AI to stitch the images together, to think about it as almost like a timeline, because these are moments in time, it's the photograph. But by taking them and then placing them next to each other, and realizing that there are these interstitials, right, that are unspoken, that are unseen, I use AI to imagine and to hallucinate what the spaces in between the images were, to stitch this together as a seamless panoramic experience. So, for example, that